tonight's edition of the Conservative Action Network program, which is hosted by CampusTeaParties.com. I'm your host today, Doreen Finkel, and our topic tonight is communism in education, and how our youth are being indoctrinated, particularly in the Christian schools. And in order to better understand communism in our schools, we must know the ABCs of communism. In education, for the communism to get started is not merely faced by constructive tasks, for in the opening phases of its activity, it is likewise faced by the destructive tasks. The educational system is bequeathed to it by the capitalist society. The communists then come in to destroy everything that has made the school in the instrument of a capitalist rule. So, in undermining a nation such as the United States, the infiltration of the educational process is of prime importance by the Communist Party. And the Communists accordingly have made the invasion of schools and colleges one of their major considerations in their psychological warfare designed to control the American mind. By such cultural work, the Soviet Fifth Column obtains influence directly or indirectly over at least a portion of the American youth. Some of the young men entering our armed forces and some of the young women who must support them are brought within the orbit of pro-communist thinking and to the detriment of our national security. Future communist community leaders are also affected. Many byproducts beneficial to the conspiracy arise from this infiltration, since concealed communists in education or their friends become sponsors of communist fronts, and they aid in financing communist causes, and sometimes play a part in influencing the attitudes of certain scientists, specifically in the church circles and government agencies. This instruction, which runs through all directives to the infiltrators of our schools and colleges, they must exercise their communist influence without exposing themselves. In this very article of May 1937, an added precaution is given. Only when teachers have really mastered Marxism and Leninism will they be able to inject it into their teaching at the least risk of exposure. Dr. J.B. Matthews, after careful examination of the records, declares that since 1935, the Communist Party has enlisted the support of at least 3,500 professors, many of them as dues-paying members, and many others as fellow travelers, same as out-and-out espionage agents, some as adherents of the party line in varying degrees, and some as the unwitting dupes of subversion. So here with us today is Dr. Joe Arminio. He's the Dean of Faculty of the Society of Statesmen, and he is going to talk about slow communism and fast-paced communism and how it is infiltrating our school system, particularly the Christian schools. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me here, Doreen. We're here under adverse conditions. It's rather cold out, hence my winter cap, and I've just gotten over a cold, so I hope the audience doesn't mind too much, and you're braving the elements more than I am.
But it's a beautiful park.
But it's a very nice place to be. And we're on American soil, which is a fine thing, isn't it?
Right.
We need to distinguish between fast-paced communism and slow-paced communism. The fast-paced communism would be that of the idea of Marx or Lenin. The idea is that you would overthrow capitalism very quickly, bring about this dictatorship that they want, and then move on to their heaven on earth.
And in fast-paced communism, do they use force?
They might do that. They may be strike, if workers would go on strike, they would manipulate the unions, there might be military action involved, there's all sorts of things. But you're trying to bring it to a fever pitch quickly and have it out. And this was the idea of the communists in the mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, even through the early 20th century with V.I. Lenin. And of course we saw fast-paced communism at work in the Bolshevik Revolution. The trouble for them was, and fortunately for us, they didn't get the outcome worldwide that they wanted to get. So they came up with a new approach, and I give that the name, the name of slow-paced communism. Now the idea here is that instead of the quick overthrow, it's very slow, very protracted, very subtle, primarily working through the culture and especially the education system. And Edward Bernstein was a German communist in the early 20th century. He was one of the great promoters of this. Another one would be Antonio Gramsci, who was the head of the Party Comunisti Italiano between the First and Second World Wars. H.G. Wells, that we think so well of, we think of War of the Worlds. Well, he was actually a slow-paced communist in his thinking. And so now, of course, that was 80 years ago what you read from, and they're further along.
I think much further along. In fact, they've pretty much taken over our education system.
Well, I hope not. What has happened is that they've seemed to have gotten a very strong grip of the public schools. And we go back to John Dewey. And we go back to his Humanist Manifesto, authored in 1934. And you were quoting from a professor pointing out how there were, 3,500 professors enlisted in 1935? Well, that's 80 years ago. So you can imagine if this has progressed, and there are signs that it has, what it could be today. But we're not talking yet, though, about Christian education. We take that for granted, don't we? The Christian parent assumes that the Christian soil, Christian schools, Christian churches are at least safe. But are they?
Right. And so let me ask you this. Let's say I'm with the Communist Party, okay, and one of their main objectives is to infiltrate the education system. What might they tell me to do?
Well, one of the techniques would be to mix some truth with some lies. It's the devil's old ploy. Nothing really has changed under the sun. In fact, if I took you back 2,000 years to early Christian church history, the heresy of the Gnostics, they would say, well, there's some good things in this teaching of this philosopher, Jesus Christ, but we can do better. We can be wiser than he. So let's take the good, let's add some even better that we can thought up ourselves. Well, today they do a lot of the same sort of thing that the Gnostics do, only it's much more subtle and it's more organized. It's on a bigger scale. In fact, it's global. It's not just here, it's across the country, across the world. And the idea is you might take some texts from books that you don't think very well of, maybe from Marx or Lenin, and you would take some texts from books that you do think well of, maybe from the Bible, or perhaps from de Tocqueville, his famous book about America in the 1830s, or something from Teddy Roosevelt, from the American side of things, and you'd say, now, let's be reasonable. We don't want to be like these zealots, these communists in the Soviet Union, or these communists now elsewhere around the country who hold on to every word that Marx and Lenin spoke, nor do we want to be zealots like those Christians who do the same thing in America, who hold on to every word in the Bible as if it were gospel truth. We want to be reasonable and come to the middle ground.
Okay. Most of my people who follow me know that I have a master's in education. And once you get up there in education, that entitles you to practically write curriculum. Okay.
Curriculum development, yeah.
Right. Okay. And I know from where I studied, there are not many people who are conservative there. In fact, there are none.
Well, there are not that many.
But they're writing the curriculum. Okay. And I would say a few of them are communists. Okay. So let's say they're communists. How might they inject it into the curriculum? Like, give me an example of what they might say.
Well, they're probably going to advance the Marxist theory. They're going to tell us that man is an economic animal. He's driven by his belly, by his basest material wants and needs, that he doesn't have a soul. He's not a spiritual creature. He's not made in the likeness of God. In fact, there is no God. The only possibility of God is that man becoming God. So they would begin with this view of the world. It's not at all biblical. And they would build from there.
When I was studying in school, one of the professors said to me that he did not want to fight in any wars, and he didn't want to fight the communists. Okay? And at that time, when you're a student, a lot of times you want to go through the class, get your grade, get out, get a job, whatever. Okay? But now that I look back at that statement and I look at who this fella is, he is a communist.
You have perspective now, and it makes some more sense. Yeah. Right.
So, and this was one of the things that he had told the class. So, inevitably, he is injecting his personal views upon the class, and I now see that as a subconscious to indoctrination now, because he's saying, oh well, he didn't want to fight this. It's put the thought in my head, and this was 15 years ago, and I still remember this.
I still remember, and let's go back, for instance, during the Tet Offensive of 1968. It's rather interesting what went on then. You know that we actually won the battle. We were victorious on the battlefield. We killed 10 times as many Viet Cong as we suffered in casualties. Approximately 40,000 North Vietnamese troops and allies were killed by our forces, and we lost about 4,000. Now that's a terrible loss of life on both sides, but the point of it is we won that conflict, and yet we lost the war. And how did that happen? Because you see back home, individuals like the ones you perhaps have just referenced were dropping or insinuating the notion that this country wasn't worth fighting and dying for, that we should withdraw from the conflict, and in fact that we had been beaten. And their argument was based on the fact that the American embassy in Saigon was brought under direct attack the first time during the war, and this was some kind of proof that the enemy had us on the run. But in fact, we were victorious.
Right. So, but, and you mentioned before that the professors, or not just professors, but the communists lie. Okay. Mm-hmm. I have an example. Maybe going back about a month or two ago, we had a debate at Montclair State University, and it was between a conservative, a libertarian, and a liberal. And the liberal was communist. And he was asked a question. The question was, did you know that Stalin had killed people in his reign of power and before he got into power? And this professor turned around and said to the students, he said, that's a lie. And he said that was bull. And he said that was a part of revisionist history. And now there were a few students who understood that the professor wasn't telling the truth. But there were also other students who did not see that.
And that's a problem, because we're so far along that you can make these gross distortions. You can twist the facts or outright omit the facts or lie and get away with it with most of your students. The fact that you're a professor carries great weight. There's a great responsibility there. But I also look at the students, they need to be questioning. They need to be weighing the evidence for and against. More people need to be speaking up, but as we go along, fewer are speaking up, because perhaps there is more of the communist influence. The slow-paced communist method is working in the schools.
It is, and I'm also a teacher, okay? And when I go in the classroom, I leave all my beliefs at home, okay? But, you know, and I personally prefer to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. But some of the teachers do not do that. They take whatever they bring from the home into the classroom, and the students pick up on that.
Oh, that's right. Well, you're trying to be objective, and you're trying to go where the evidence takes you, where the truth may be. That's what you're trying to train your students to do. And often folks come in there with a very different agenda. And some of them have an agenda of the slow-paced communist.
They do. Okay, let's also go to two people, and one you mentioned already, John Dewey and John Rawls. Well, okay, John Dewey co-authored the Humanist Manifesto, and he's also regarded as the father of modern-day education. And the NEA has given him high marks for that. And I see the smirk on your face, but go ahead. He wrote The Theory of Education and Democracy based on Darwin's theory of evolution, which praises change and declares that the highest good is positive change. And I see you smirking all the way when I say that. Go ahead.
Well, because the first thing that comes to my mind is God doesn't change. He's immutable. He is love and truth, and that is forever. And this is, we have felt that as a race, we've seen it, and it's been promised to us. So the first thing that the communists want you to do, or anyone of that persuasion, is to make you think that everything is contingent. It's situational. It depends on the situation. There isn't absolute standards. There's not an absolute morality. That's very critical in the process, because you see, we know with Christ that there is, and we know that heaven has to wait. We can do some good on earth, but ultimately heaven is in heaven. But the communist wants us to think that we can have a heaven on earth, and he has to get us away from this notion of an afterlife and away from a sense of an absolute morality. And this is one of the critical ways they do it. Situational thinking, situational ethics they call it. Not an absolute standard.
And you also mentioned that the slow-paced communism has infiltrated the classical Christian schools and home schools and universities, primarily the same way it's infiltrated the regular school system. People have been, the communists have trained people. Go ahead.
With the Christian school, it's a little slower, and you can imagine why, because they have to be more careful. The Christian parents just around the corner, they're talking to the son or daughter over the dinner table. They don't want to be too direct. So what might be going on, it could be that in some schools, some faculty, perhaps not even aware of it necessarily, are conditioning the student to look forward to certain authors, certain texts, a certain curriculum. So when they get to college, they think this is a legitimate course of study, and in fact it probably isn't. They get involved, and they shouldn't. Or they should get involved and listen to what the other fellow has to say, but weigh it from the Christian, biblical, and patriotic point of view.
So do you think if the Christian parents found out that this stuff was seeping into the curriculum, they would stop sending their students?
Well, they'd be very unhappy. I'd like to think that they would react. I'd like to think they would bring this to the attention of the faculty. We got to remember, at the end of the day, we don't know what is in a person's heart. Unless, of course, through their testimony, through their deeds, we can have a pretty good idea. And even then, they might be still mistaken. But you would like to think the parent would speak up. And this goes back, by the way, to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, where Paul tells us that we are to raise up the child in the Christian paideia. Now, that is a very specific reference by Paul. Paideia is a Greek word. In his day, it had a very specific meaning. The pagans, especially in Athens, would nurture the child comprehensively. Not just in the classroom, but when they would walk by a pagan temple, they would praise the god on that temple. When they were at dinner table, they would praise the gods. So what Paul's saying is we have to do what they're doing, but do it subordinated to Christ, hence the Christian paideia. And so I would like to think that the parent would feel that, and I think they do. I think the Holy Spirit pricks their conscience. And so if we can bring this to their attention, if more people will bring this to their attention, that they will act on that information as the Holy Spirit wants them to act.
So let's say, now I am a professor, okay, and I'm a communist one, okay. The goal of me then to promote communism in the schools would be not to overly teach it, like you're saying.
No, especially in a Christian school. You want to be very, very subtle about it. We're assuming the person knows what they're doing. They're doing this willfully.
Right. And so like you've mentioned, there's probably hundreds of other ways to inject the communism in the curriculum, other than coming out and telling everybody, hey, I'm a communist.
That's right. There may be some other ways. For instance, you could, one of the ways they work is to keep us in a sense of trauma, in a sense of suspense or fear. So you might constantly bring up what happened on September 11th. If you have a sixth grader, a seventh grader, an eighth grader, and every anniversary rolls around and you remind them and show them pictures of the burning building and so forth, you're undermining their confidence, their trust in their authority, and you're making them perhaps subject to manipulation. There's a lot of ways to do it, not just with a textbook. It can be where you take them, for instance, you could take them to a museum that might push this line. In fact, I remember in Washington, D.C., in the zoo, in the National Zoo, there is a reptile building, and we're told that the snake is actually a wonderful creature, and they're actually attacking what we know about the snake in Genesis to put the snake back as this magnificent creature that he's not. So you get it in all kinds of ways.
So inevitably, they're doing psychological warfare on us.
You might say yes, yeah. It
that's
is.
what we.
It is a subtle, It is a subtle form of psychological warfare. Yes, you could say that. And so, but there's nothing new in a sense. Nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon would say. This has been going on. We have to keep our wits about us, and we have to focus ultimately on the truth. And that's really, we're talking about the facts pertaining to the life of Christ. Understand that liberty comes from those facts. Understand, for instance, one of the great ironies in this country, and this is something that I hope that people who are agnostic or not sure about Christ would think about. They must realize that the greatest defender of private property, and where does our happiness come from? A lot of it comes from private property. The greatest defender of private property is the Christian church, has always been. And that's because it's part of the natural law. God believed that you're best able to control your immediate environment, to take responsibility for that environment. He doesn't want you in a collective. He wants you, and you are responsible to him. So he wants you to have private property. He wants you to be a good steward of that. And he wants a system of government that will nurture that. That's Christian thinking. So the communist undermines private property. It's one of the things that Karl Marx raved about, private property and the evils of these capitalists, and these free markets and so forth. Wants to tear that down and get us away from that. And so this is not directed as much at the non-believer as the believer. They've got to realize if they don't come to their senses soon, they're not going to enjoy the blessings and the happiness they have. And they owe it to, of all things, those Christians.
That's right. So, what would you do to try to, try to alleviate the situation in education? I can't say fix it. Is it fixable?
Perhaps it is. And if I were to take you back to what some of the prophets in Israel would say, the city of Jerusalem being under siege and so on, Jeremiah would give advice. And down throughout history, God's people would get themselves in terrible trouble because they weren't behaving, they weren't worshiping him as they should. He would send a prophet to wake them up. And he would tell them, if you will redirect yourself to me, I will magnify your efforts, your modest efforts. I will give you relief far beyond what you could give yourself. And that's something we need to be looking more toward. Instead, we try to go in the public square and do everything ourselves. And so if you think about this, ultimately this is not a political contest, this is a spiritual battle we're in. In politics, we see the manifestations of the spiritual war. We can't see these fights between the dark angel and the light angels and so forth. We can't see it, but we can sense it in the public square, in the erosion of the Constitution, in the growth of government where it shouldn't be growing. And so we should push back there, but we should ultimately go to the root, which is a spiritual contest, and get people back to focusing upon Christ.
As a parent, and I would further that, I would also look through what's being taught in the curriculum.
That's right. You
Everything.
Need search out the curriculum. You look for the subtleties. Look for conditioning. Look for where does this author come from? Which brings up a very interesting point. There are some books out there telling you how to read books, for instance. And what I always found interesting about these books, I'm not sure of all of them, but often they don't tell you the most important question to ask. They'll say, well, you should ask what was the plot about? What's the character about? Who's the protagonist? What's the topic? What's the purpose of that sort of thing. But they never ask you to ask, where did the author get his money to write the book?
That's right.
That's right. Who's funding it? That's right. Aha. So you find out who's funding that author, you work backward. This is a parent doing their job, following Ephesians 6:4. Find out, so if you have a book coming into your school, who wrote the book and who funded them to write the book? These are questions that parents are not asking. They're assuming that the faculty, even in the Christian school, are doing their job and that they're asking those questions. They're not. They used to. They don't do it very often anymore. So the parent has to reassert themselves. Get to the root.
So it's almost like in a communist society, a child is a part of that society, but in a capitalist society, where individualism is focused on, then the child is a product of particularly that family or that marriage.
That's right. Well, we're mostly Christian. We're family oriented as a nation. That was the concept, and that requires taking responsibility yourself. But they're taking that thought away from us. They want us to think that we're part of something more than ourselves in a collective sense. That the other fellow over the hill knows better, that the state capitol down the street, they know better, the national capital knows better than we know. No, because at the end of the day, you're going to stand in front of God and have to give an accounting. And there's not going to be anybody there from the collective to stand next to you. So you better be able to give that accounting. And so therefore you have to look at the text, where they're coming from, what they're talking to the students about, where they're taking the students on their field trips. When he goes to college, you still have to keep an eye on him. In fact, it's more dangerous. The further away he gets from you, the more dangerous. Which I hope also can bring us to the subject of one of the apprenticeships that we offer. One way you're asking,
yes,
how can we get this, and let's be very practical about this. You know, you had me on a couple of months ago when we were talking about the presidential campaign oratory of Obama and Romney. And we were talking about how it seemed awful that both sides were saying the American dream is alive when, as I look at it, it's been dead 40 years. And we said, well, there's no living wage anymore. You have to have two spouses work outside the home. Well, in preparing for this discussion, I took a look at some budget facts. And these are very simple facts which could have been shared with the American public, but they weren't. And so if we take a look at them, where are we right now? Where are we going if we don't make major changes? And then what I would suggest is, in fact, we offer this as Society of Statesmen. We offer a discussion about public policy. We give you the baseline since the beginning of the country. So now you know what has worked in the past, and then we talk about how to fix these problems going forward.
Okay, I need to wrap up this edition of the Conservative Action Network show, and I'd like to thank Dr. Joe Arminio for coming on our show.
And we braved the elements to go
Yes, we
successfully.
braved the elements out here. And I'd like to thank our listeners for listening and watching us today, and tune in to next week for our next edition.
Thanks for having me.